Hi, and welcome back to the Seventh Day Ox. I'm very eager to know. Hello, kitty. Goodbye, kitty. I'm eager to know what happens. So, let's get going. Chapter 29. The last rays of the late setting summer sun were cutting across the landscape as Nikolai took Maxim to the stable. He hurriedly unhooked Maxim from the cart and pulled the harness from his neck and shoulders. Then he got the tired ox some sedge grass and slapped him on the rump. I want you to enjoy this rest, Maxim. You deserve it. He stepped to the stable doorway and then turned to the old ox one last time. I hope you know I won't be coming for you tomorrow morning. We don't have to work at all tomorrow. We've earned a rest, both of us, and we're going to get it. Nikolai went to one of the water barrels, scooped some water out with a wooden bucket, and headed back to the barracks. It was time for a good bath. When he was dressed in the only other shirt and pair of clothes that he owned, he went to the kitchen for something to eat, before Petya closed the kitchen for the night. As usual, he was late for supper, but as usual, Petya had a bowl of borscht waiting for him. He also had a side order of Russian black bread and a rare slab of cheese. Well, this is a delicacy. Nikolai smiled as he savored a bite of the yellow cheese. Where'd you get it? It's got to be the best treat I've seen in camp yet. An old man who lives not far from here has a few reindeer he tamed. He milks some of the does and then makes cheese. I was surprised, the cook added, cutting off a thin slice of the cheese for himself. It does taste pretty good for reindeer cheese. But then again, I've never eaten reindeer cheese before, so I guess I don't know what it's supposed to taste like. After supper, Nikolai ambled over to the warden's office to give him the news. He had managed to haul the needed water barrels for the Sabbath hours. The warden looked up from his desk in surprise. You've gotten 10 barrels in camp right now full of water? Yes, sir. Nikolai tried not to sound too happy. He didn't want the warden to think of some extra task he might need done. That would be a dirty trick, even for the warden, Nikolai thought. Very well then, Panchuk. Go on and rest. You deserve it. I understand you've been putting in some pretty late nights. The warden turned back to what he was doing. Oh, and Panchuk, he added, as he stared at Nikolai over the top of his horn-rimmed glasses. What was with the ox today? They told me the animal was going wild on you. Wouldn't stop running. Nikolai smiled sheepishly. Yes, sir, he was a bit overwrought. Overwrought, the warden nearly burst out laughing. According to everyone who saw him, he was more like crazy. Yes, sir, I'd have to agree with you there. A bit crazy. I can't account for it, but he was, well, we'll just say God helped us get the water in. How could Nikolai explain what he really thought? That God had spooked the old ox? Or put a bug in his ear? Or given him a shot of adrenaline that had lasted all day? Perhaps he should have told the warden more about the power of his God. Perhaps, but then it didn't matter because the warden didn't really want to know and was waving him off. And so the Sabbath began for Nikolai. He didn't flaunt his time off. Instead, he stayed inside the barracks and prayed most of the day. The other prisoners all went to their work assignments, so he had the time to himself. Even the guards left him alone. Over and over again he thanked God for the miracle performed on his behalf. God had indeed done a marvelous thing, and he had done it with a dumb ox. The whole thing reminded Nikolai of the story in the Bible where God had used a donkey to be his mouthpiece. The donkey hadn't really wanted to be a part of the whole adventure, but like Maxim, he had been drawn unwittingly into the grand plot of the story when Balaam decided to disobey God. On the road to Moab, an angel of God tried to prevent Balaam and his donkey from going on a mission to curse Israel. Balaam didn't know that, of course, and he gave the donkey the beating of its life. The poor old donkey put up quite a fuss, and then started talking. Nikolai thought about the similarities between Maxim and Balaam's donkey. Like Balaam's donkey, Maxim had been used by God to be his witness. Like the donkey, Maxim was a part of a wonderful miracle that might very well be told down through the years of time. The day turned out to be a grand day of rest and relaxation for Nikolai, and he enjoyed the fruit of his labors with relish. He couldn't remember when he had felt in more complete peace. And he slept some. He deserved it, he felt, for all the nights of short sleep and for having to run behind the ox cart all day on Friday. He figured that he had run some 24 or 25 kilometers. Nikolai went to the mess hall somewhere near sunset. All of the men had already eaten when he arrived, so Petya let him come back into the kitchen and eat there so that they could talk. Chapter 30. Is it true, the cook asked, a gleam of admiration in his eye? Nikolai smiled humbly. You mean about old Maxim? Exactly. I know you got your quota of barrels, but I also heard that you brought in 8 cartloads of water in one day. Nikolai shrugged his shoulders and kept on smiling. That's 16 barrels of water, preacher man. Nikolai knew Petya wasn't making fun. The name sounded more like a term of endearment coming from Petya. That's right, it's more than I ever managed before. Ha! Petya grunted. I hear it's a record, more than anyone else hauled in one day. That's so? Nikolai knew that he had to share the whole story with Petya. He couldn't let Petya think that it had been his doing, or even old Maxim's for that matter. If anyone would understand, Petya would. I can't take credit for all the water I hauled yesterday. Petya stared at him with raised eyebrows. That's right. You see, I'm a man of prayer, Petya. After those 2 years in the box, I learned to depend on God for everything. He helped me deal with the pain and hunger. He gave me peace of mind when I needed it most, and I thanked him especially for life. I owe him my life many times over. So your God helped you haul all that water? How did he do that? By giving old Maxim super amounts of stamina and energy and inspiration. Strength enough to go all day, running constantly without ever stopping to eat, and inspiration to do it in the first place. A little water was all he had, and a few carrots I brought him along the way. Petya shook his head. Well, I did find the part about the ox almost unbelievable. Does the warden know all this? I don't think so. I didn't tell him. He didn't ask. Petya sat on a stool staring at Nikolai. Did you ask God to do that for you? I didn't ask him to do that specifically for me because I didn't know it was possible. Nikolai shook his head. But I did ask my God to please help me find some way to haul enough water so that I wouldn't have to work on the Sabbath. So your God came up with this, huh? Pretty neat. Petya looked pensive. Does your God help everyone who asks? Everyone who comes to him in faith, everyone who seeks him with all their heart and soul and mind. And that's what you do? As a Christian pastor, I must say I have always done that, by his grace. There was silence in the kitchen for quite some time. The only sound that could be heard was the sound of the hot kitchen stove popping and snapping as it slowly cooled for the night. Would he do such a thing for me? Petya asked earnestly, and Nikolai could hardly believe his ears. Here was a man wanting God to come into his life and touch him. This man was asking the essential question of every seeker who has ever come to Jesus. What must I do to be saved? Nikolai went to bed that night, inspired and energized for another week. What the week would bring was anybody's guess, but one thing was for sure. He would have more time this week, so he wouldn't have to kill himself or Maxim. He wouldn't have to run the ox into the ground every day to get the water that he would need. This week he would need to bring in 70 barrels of water in 6 days. Earlier than usual the next morning, Nikolai was in the barn, hitching Maxim up to the cart. But strangely enough, Maxim was in no hurry to get going. It was as if all the energy had gone out of his bones, as if he had used up Sunday's energy supply on Friday. Try as he might, Nikolai was powerless to get old Maxim going. By the end of the day, he had managed to bring in only 10 barrels of water, and they had to work after dusk or dark to do that. Monday was no better. It seemed that the harder Nikolai pushed Maxim, the slower he moved. Did the old ox know something Nikolai didn't? Was he playing some kind of silly game just to pit his wits against the man? Was it some kind of standoff again, where Maxim did what he wanted, when he wanted? Or was it nothing of the sort? Had the previous Friday just been a freak accident of nature? Had it been an incredible, unexplainable phenomena of animal behavior that no one had ever seen, or would ever see again? Nikolai had hoped that on Tuesday he might make up for the loads that he had failed to haul on the first 2 days of the week. But Tuesday was a bust too, and the outcome worried Nikolai, leaving him feeling frustrated and confused. He was now getting up so early every morning that he had to wonder if he was losing all touch with reality. What kind of a life was this? He was going to bed at night after everyone else, and was getting up before anyone in camp had even stirred. By dawn, he and Maxim were usually already on their way to the spring. On Wednesday they made some progress. Old Maxim seemed to have new life in his step once again, and he moved with purpose all that morning. By mid-morning it was clear to Nikolai that they would be able to bring in at least 7 loads. That was an extra 4 barrels towards his goal of 10. Nikolai was still holding out hope that there might be a chance of filling his quota by Friday night. Maxim was moving with a purpose now, and he didn't let up all day. Nikolai felt so good about the rate at which they were working now that he found himself singing an old hymn. O God, our help in ages past, our hope for years to come, our shelter from the stormy blast, and our eternal home. Under the shadow of thy throne, still may we dwell secure. Sufficient is thine arm alone, and our defense is sure. Nikolai could feel the power of the Holy Spirit beside him out there on the lonely road to the spring. He raised his hands to the sky as he sang the final verse of the old hymn in a throaty baritone voice. O God, our help in ages past, our hope for years to come, be thou our guide while life shall last, and our eternal home. Nikolai went to bed that night feeling that the day had been a success, but he secretly dreaded the coming of another day. What chance did he have of making the quota? If he could somehow haul 7 loads the next day, it would be their only hope. 7 loads on Thursday would give them a total of 8 barrels toward the extra 10 that they needed, but he knew that he could haul no less. Even so, that would still leave them with another 6 trips needed on Friday. Unfortunately, Thursday was a bomb again. Maxim was back to his old tricks of poking along the wind-swept road to the spring. If the situation hadn't seemed so serious to Nikolai, he might have taken the time to feel sorry for the old ox. Now all he had time for was exasperation. At the end of the long day, they had managed to bring in a measly 10 barrels. They had only made 5 trips, 2 trips short of his goal. They were now 6 barrels short of the tally that they would need to bring in by Friday sunset. And with that realization, still far short of their goal, all of Nikolai's hopes died. Chapter 31. On Friday morning, Nikolai didn't even bother to get out of bed early. What was the point? It wouldn't be possible for them to finish the job by sunset anyway. There were just too many barrels of water to bring into camp by the time the Sabbath would begin. It didn't seem to matter that Nikolai had prayed and worked hard all week again, stretching every fiber of his being to add to the number of barrels needed. It had all been for nothing. Finally, just after dawn, Nikolai got up and headed for the kitchen. There was no sense of urgency now. He could afford to get some breakfast this morning. On his way to the kitchen, another prisoner called out to him, "You'd better go to the stables and check on that old ox. I think he's gone crazy. He's making a lot of racket in there." Nikolai stopped in his tracks. He wanted to ignore the man's announcement, but a faint hope of something a week old flickered in his heart. It wasn't possible, was it? Could Maxim be thinking of trying to run a repeat performance? Nikolai turned and headed for the stables, and the closer he got, the more optimistic he became. Old Maxim was indeed going berserk, if that was really him making all the noise. It sounded as if he was trying to pull the stable down, posts and all. "I don't believe it," Nikolai yelled, rushing through the open stable door. There stood Maxim, yanking on his chain and pawing at the ground impatiently. Nikolai surveyed the scene for only a moment, and then he flew into action. If old Maxim wanted to haul water barrels, then that was what they would do. It was later than Nikolai would have liked it to be, and he wished with all his heart now that he'd gotten up by faith and done his part. But he had not, and so he had to make up for the hour or so that he had wasted in bed, if God would be merciful. It was a strange and almost comical feeling Nikolai had as he hurriedly unhooked Maxim from his chain, threw the harness over his neck and shoulders, and hitched him to the ox cart. All week he had worked early and late to accomplish his purpose. It had been all that he could think of day and night. But then, when things didn't turn out as he had planned, his faith had floundered and he had lost sight of the goal. What a shame! Nikolai scolded himself over and over. Now, when he desperately needed to be up and on his way, he had been sleeping on the job. "Forgive me, Lord," he fervently prayed. "I'm not worthy of your goodness. Help me to make up for the lost time. Help Maxim to do his part. He's more worthy of your grace than I." Nikolai heaved a sigh as he checked the rope that held the barrels securely in place. Sometimes dumb animals weren't so dumb. At least they knew how to listen to God's voice. He thought about the story of Balaam and his donkey again, and how God had worked through the action of an animal. When Balaam couldn't see God's will, a willing donkey had. And now it appeared God was ready to use Maxim again. The ox was willing. It was the man who lacked the faith. In short order, they were off to the spring. If anyone had been watching, they would have seen the ox running full tilt out of camp, his tail flying and the cart bouncing along behind him, and the man running for all he was worth to keep up. It was as if the ox were on a mission, and indeed he was. No longer did it appear as if the man was in charge. Clearly the ox was in control and determining the pace at which they would work. On and on he ran, as if in a frenzy, as if he had somehow lost his mind. Again Nikolai felt it was the strangest thing he had ever seen. It was as if the angels had built a fire under Maxim and ignited his spirit to fulfill God's will and greatest wish, that Nikolai be rewarded for his desire to honor God's holy Sabbath. All week it had been Nikolai who had been pushing them hard to bring extra barrels of water to the kitchen, always mindful that they needed to tally a tally of 70 in order to make the mark. And all week Maxim had done his part, but more often than not, he had worked with less energy than Nikolai wished he would. Now it was Friday again, the preparation day, and Maxim was on a mission. The trip to the spring for their first load of water was run in record time. It was not a complete surprise that Maxim was running helter-skelter to and from the spring. Nikolai had witnessed him acting this way the previous Friday, but it was a shock that he was doing it for the second week in a row. It helped to remove any doubt in Nikolai's mind that such a thing might have been a freak accident the week before. As Nikolai ran panting behind the cart all the way back to camp, he had to admit that God does work in mysterious ways. As everyone in camp watched Nikolai and Maxim, it confirmed in their minds, even more than the week before, that the God of heaven was again working on Nikolai's behalf. How else could it be interpreted? Since entering the camp, Nikolai had been a living testimony of determination and loyalty. The colors of his character were beginning to become obvious to everyone, prisoners and guards alike. Even the warden had been forced to admit that here was a man of the highest caliber, one who would rather suffer persecution and pain than dishonor the God that he served. And now again they were witnessing a miracle in action, evidence of the power God was willing to demonstrate on Nikolai's behalf. It was a strange and unusual sight, man and ox running full speed into camp, the ox cart rolling along with 2 full barrels of water on board. And it was equally bizarre to see Maxim turn the ox cart around and head back to the spring as soon as the full water barrels were taken off and the empty ones dropped into place. And then the whole performance would repeat itself again as man and beast were seen speeding out of camp and across the wide open spaces of the Siberian steppes. Fantastic. We're going to do one more chapter. Chapter 32. All that morning, Nikolai and Maxim worked, sweat pouring from their bodies. It was an amazing and almost comical sight. As the two could be seen approaching the camp, someone would always signal their arrival with a shout, "Here they come again!" And then everyone within range would stop whatever it was they were doing, prisoners and guards alike. Petya would always come out of the kitchen for a look. It was a great way to take a break. By the time Nikolai and Maxim returned to the camp the third time, everyone was cheering and throwing their caps into the air. Nikolai hardly had time to notice their shouts of encouragement. He did give a tired salute on his entry into camp, and then another wave of his arm again as the cart spun around to make its next trip to the spring. If Nikolai had been watching on the 4th trip back to camp, he would have noticed that even the warden had stopped what he was doing to come out and see the amazing spectacle. By noon, they were already heading out for their 5th trip to the spring. As Nikolai hurried to catch up with the ox, Petya ran alongside him and handed him a small bag with cold turnips and Russian black bread in it. Nikolai had managed to drink a little water each time they stopped at the spring and the camp, but he had not thought of eating. Now he realized that he was famished, and he was so grateful for the friendship of this man who was watching out for him. He ate the turnips as he ran, praying that God would help the food to digest in spite of the conditions in which he was eating the meal. On the return trip, Nikolai saw 4 or 5 of the prairie wolves come out and sit in a row to watch the man and ox race by. He tossed a chunk of black bread to the wolves and watched them fight over it as the cart raced away to the east. The kilometers became easier to run and his breathing less strenuous. It was as if God was giving Nikolai a second and third wind, so he could become part of the miracle in action. The day melted away as trip after trip was made until there was only one last run to be made. By now the man and beast were running in tandem as though the adventure had turned them into a well-oiled machine, and they finished the task with time to spare. By the time the sun dipped below the western horizon, Nikolai had unloaded the last water barrel, gone to the barracks to clean up, and was on his way to the kitchen to eat the evening meal he knew Petya would have waiting for him there. What a day it had been, and what a lesson in faith for Nikolai. In his heart he knew that he would never again doubt God's amazing watch care and his ability to come to the aid of a soul in need. Of course, Nikolai believed in the power of God to protect and preserve, and he knew of God's willingness to act on behalf of his children in time of need. But he had never experienced such a dramatic display of God's power to vindicate one of his children. And to everyone in camp, this had been a clear demonstration of the length to which Nikolai's God would go to honor the pastor for his faithfulness. As Nikolai sat in the kitchen eating a hot bowl of borscht and sipping a cup of tea, the cook spoke of the electricity that had ignited the camp. "You did it again," Petya exclaimed. "It was amazing." "We did it," Nikolai countered. "Maxim and I did it, and we owe it to God, from whom all blessings flow." Petya shook his head in disbelief. "I wish you could have seen the two of you," he crowed. "What a sight!" He handed Nikolai another slice of black bread. "You two are like celebrities here in camp now. I don't suppose the warden will ever give you trouble again. He can't. The guards won't let him." On his way back to the barracks, Nikolai stopped to watch the moon rising in the east. The orange oval of light looked warm and inviting, like the feeling he had in his chest. For the first time since arriving in camp over 2 years ago, he felt exhilaratingly free. And God was responsible for it. It had taken a while for Nikolai to see his prayers fully realized, but in the end things had worked out for the best, with God being justified and Nikolai feeling vindicated. Nikolai decided that it was always best to fully trust in God's timing, because only God could see the end from the beginning. As Nikolai turned to enter the barracks, he could hear the prairie wolves howling somewhere in the distant darkness, but the sound no longer made him feel lonely. He remembered feeling lost and forlorn when he had first arrived in camp. The sound of the prairie wolves had left him feeling empty, and he had even been tempted to feel abandoned by God, but not any longer. Clearer than ever before was his faith in Jesus. It was a moment of truth for him, and it thrilled him through and through to know that God was with him even on the wastelands of the Siberian tundra. To have a peace like that was truly worth dying for. But of course, it didn't look as if that was what God required now. He had stood the test and had come through shining. What an amazing story. What just an incredible thing that God has done for this man's faithfulness. And I just love how God did it. So he got all the praise and glory. We can't deny the power of God. We have one more night. There's just a few chapters left in this book. So join me tomorrow night for our last 3 chapters.